Before the frontier had legends, it had men who refused to die. This is the true story of Hugh Glass, the trapper who crawled 200 miles through hell and lived. A tribute to the endurance, silence, and spirit that defined the American frontier. The year was 1823, a year that pushed men to the very edge of what was possible. Across the upper Missouri, the wilderness was no longer a blank space on a map. It was a promise and a grave. But how far could one man crawl from death? From the muddy riverbanks of St. Louis, a column of 100 trappers and hunters moved north beneath the banner of General William Henry Ashley and Captain Andrew Henry. They sought beaver, the soft fur that built empires, and the fortune that waited in the teeth of the frontier. Their keelboats were heavy with powder, traps, whiskey, and hope. The men were heavy with pride. They came from everywhere: farmhands, deserters, thieves, sailors, the restless breed that looked west because east had already told them no. The Missouri carried them through a land that felt older than time, miles of grass that waved like ocean, forests thick as smoke, and skies too large for prayer. But with every mile upriver, civilization fell away. The laughter grew quieter, the fires smaller. At night, the men spoke in low voices of Arikara raids and ghosts that followed from the tree line. Among them rode a man older than his years, Hugh Glass, lean, silent, and built like something that had survived more than once. His hands bore the pale rope scars of old captivity, his back the cross-hatched marks of knife and fire. To most men, he was a mystery. To himself, he was simply what the wild had left behind. He rarely spoke. When others joked, he worked, mending a trap, scraping hide, setting his fire just low enough to keep off wolves without wasting heat. He had the patience of stone and the caution of a man who'd already met death once and found it overrated. By the third week upriver, they reached the Grand River country, the heart of Arikara land. It was a place of deep-cut valleys and tall grass that whispered secrets. The men set camp near a bend in the river. The water ran clear, cold, and deceivingly calm. That night, Glass watched the horizon while others drank. A young trapper, a wiry boy named Jim Bridger, barely 17, his part in the story recorded by legend, sat beside him, wide-eyed and restless. "You ever scared out here, Mr. Glass?" he asked. Glass didn't look up. "Fear keeps a man breathing," he said, "but it don't keep him alive." Bridger frowned, unsure whether it was advice or warning. Glass only fed another stick to the fire and watched it turn to ember. As sleep took the camp, Glass's thoughts went backward to the Pawnee village, where he'd once been tied to a post, left for the smoke and the sun. The memory came sharp, the heat on his face, the sound of chanting, the moment a Pawnee elder had stepped forward and cut him free instead of finishing him. That elder had taught him to move with the land, not against it, to listen to wind as speech and stone as warning. From them, Glass had learned to heal wounds with ash and clay, to eat the earth's roots before dying in pride. It was that quiet education, not the rifle, not the trap, that had kept him alive long enough to see this river. Morning came pale and brittle. A mist hung over the valley. Men stretched, cursed, and packed their traps. Then, without warning, the silence broke. The Arikara came with the sun, painted riders from the bluffs, arrows cutting through the smoke of morning fires. Chaos took the camp in seconds. Bullets hissed, horses screamed, powder horns spilled. The river turned black with silt and blood. Glass fought from behind a felled tree, musket braced, jaw set. He saw men scatter into the grass, others fall where they stood. When the shooting slowed, 15 trappers lay dead, their bodies sprawled among the broken kettles and bloodied hides. Captain Henry counted the living and knew the truth. They were outnumbered, undersupplied, and deep inside enemy country. He called the survivors together under a torn canvas. "We split," he said. "Two parties, one north toward the Grand, one west toward the Yellowstone. God willing, one of us reaches the post alive." The men nodded, too tired for speeches. Glass volunteered for the Northern Trail, His reasons were simple: fewer miles meant fewer graves. The next morning they moved out. The land stretched endless: ridges of clay, grass like the sea, rivers running brown and fast. The wind cut through their coats like a knife. They crossed sandbars where the river braided itself into silver threads, their horses shivering in the cold water. At night they slept under skins, the firelight painting long shadows on the cottonwoods. That evening, Bridger approached Glass again. "Do you reckon we'll make it?" he asked. Glass chewed a strip of dried meat before answering. "Only the quiet ones," he said. Bridger didn't understand, but he nodded all the same. When dawn broke, frost had rimed the grass white. The men loaded up and followed the river's bend. Glass took point, his usual place, eyes scanning the earth for tracks, reading signs no one else noticed: broken stems, bent grass, the faint scent of musk. Then he stopped. The air had shifted. Even the birds had gone still. Something unseen watched from the far side of the willows. He raised a hand, the signal for silence, and stepped forward, rifle low. The others froze, eyes searching the grass. Glass felt the pulse of the ground through his boots, the cold breath of something enormous that waited just beyond sight. He took one more step, slow and deliberate. The world held its breath. By morning, the wilderness had already chosen its survivors. By mid-morning, the sun broke pale and sharp over the Grand River Valley. Its light scattered through fog and reeds. The air smelled of wet earth and frost. A good sign for trapping, a bad one for staying alive. Hugh Glass led the column as always, rifle balanced in his hands, his breath steady, eyes scanning the horizon. Behind him walked Jim Bridger, light-footed and eager, and John Fitzgerald, heavier, older, his face carved with suspicion. They had seen bear sign the night before: half-eaten berries, overturned logs, a claw mark in the clay. Glass had warned them quietly: "She's close. Watch the wind." Now the woods stood still, too still. Even the crows had fallen silent. Glass crouched, touched the soil, soft and fresh. The track was large, the claws long. He raised his head, and the truth came like a whisper. She was right ahead. Two cubs stumbled through a chokecherry thicket, noses red with pulp. Glass froze. Every instinct screamed: back away, slow and easy. He took one step. The brush exploded. The mother grizzly came on him like a storm of muscle and earth. 700 pounds of hunger and fury. Glass barely swung the muzzle up. The flint sparked. The shot cracked. And the ball tore into her shoulder, too shallow to stop her. Then she was on him. The first strike broke his leg below the knee. The second tore across his back, ripping cloth and flesh alike. Her claws were hooked knives, her breath a furnace. Glass screamed once, a sound half human, half wind, then went silent, lost beneath the roar. He drove his knife upward, burying it into fur, then flesh. The bear reared, bellowed, fell, rolled over him, crushing air from his lungs. The world became teeth, mud, and blood. When the other trappers reached him, the beast was already down. The musket balls had done what courage could not. The bear twitched once, then stilled. For a long minute, no one moved. Bridger stood frozen, eyes wide. Fitzgerald spat in the dirt and muttered, "Christ alive, he's still breathing." They turned him over. Glass's body was ruin, chest clawed open, ribs visible beneath torn flesh, his scalp half flayed. His throat had been bitten through, leaving a gaping wound that whistled with each breath. Yet somehow, he breathed. They built a litter from saplings and rawhide strips and carried him back to camp. Every jolt made him groan, blood seeping through the bindings. When they laid him down by the fire, he was barely a shape of a man. For 2 days they kept vigil. They washed the wounds with whiskey, changed bandages, kept the flies off with smoke. He drifted between worlds, sometimes whispering nonsense, sometimes staring into nothing. On the third morning, Captain Henry gathered the men. The camp was uneasy. Arikara scouts had been seen again along the ridges. Henry looked down at Glass, then at the men. "He won't last another night," he said. "If we stay, none of us will." He asked for 2 volunteers to remain behind. to bury the man when he passed. Silence fell. Then Fitzgerald stepped forward. "I'll stay," he said, the words almost too quick. Henry nodded. "One more." Bridger hesitated, eyes on the dying man. "I'll stay too." Henry left them with Glass, 2 days' rations and a shovel. Then the column moved on, their footfalls fading into the grass. The nights that followed were long and cruel. Wolves circled close. The air stank of blood. Fitzgerald sat awake with his rifle across his knees, muttering, "We're sitting ducks." Bridger kept watch by the fire, watching Glass's chest rise and fall like a stubborn tide. By the 4th day, the boy was shaking from exhaustion. Fitzgerald's patience had turned to anger. "Look at him," he hissed. "He's done. Dead already. The real find us before the worms do." Bridger whispered, "He's still breathing." Fitzgerald snarled, "Not for long." They argued in the dark, fear sharpening every word. Then came a distant shout, echoing off the ridges, Arikara voices, carrying on the wind. That was enough. Fitzgerald's hand was trembling as he grabbed the powder horn and Glass's knife. "Dig a hole," he said. "He deserves that much." Together, they scraped a shallow trench beside the cottonwoods, rolled Glass halfway into it, and covered him with brush. Then, with the first light of dawn, they ran. For a long while, the world was still again, only the wind and the flies moving. Then, from the dirt and blood, came a sound, a slow, rattling breath. Hugh Glass opened his eyes to a sky pale and wide as judgment. The bear had taken his flesh. The men had taken his tools. All he had left was the thing both had underestimated, his will. He tried to speak, but only a whisper of blood came. He was alone now, buried half alive in the land that had no mercy and no memory. But he was not done. He pressed one arm forward, then another. The crawl had begun. When they left him for dead, the earth kept its breath. For 3 days after the bear attack, the plains stayed silent, a silence too deep, too deliberate. Then, somewhere beneath a thin cover of leaves and dirt, a sound broke the stillness. A man refusing to die. Hugh Glass clawed his way out of his own grave. His skin hung in ribbons, his leg twisted and swollen, his throat torn nearly to ruin. He had no rifle, no knife, no fire, only the will that the wilderness itself seemed unwilling to extinguish. He dragged himself to the riverbank and drank mud-brown water until he vomited, then drank again. The pain came like thunder, white, rolling, endless. But pain meant he was still in the world, and that was enough. He began to crawl. Each pull of his arms left streaks of blood behind him, each inch of progress paid for with agony. He used one arm for pulling, one knee for steering. Sometimes he passed out and woke hours later beneath the same tree. But he kept moving. Glass remembered the Pawnee healer's words, the voice from his fever. Man who fears death dies once. Man who learns it never dies again. He clung to that sentence the way drowning men cling to wood. His first meal was half-rotten berries he found under a thicket. The second was a snake, crushed with a rock and eaten raw. He packed the wounds with river clay to keep out the flies and used thin reeds as splints. When the cold came at night, he buried himself in the grass for warmth. Days blurred into weeks. He followed the Grand River downstream, crawling when he could not walk, drifting when the water allowed. By measuring the stars and sun habits of his seafaring youth, he guessed his route. If his reckoning was right, Fort Kiowa lay nearly 200 miles southeast. A man on horseback could make it in 10 days. A man on his belly might never make it at all. Once, a pair of wolves brought down a bison calf near the river. When they left, Glass crawled to what was left, tore raw meat with shaking hands, and lived another week. Another time, he stumbled upon a patch of prairie turnips, dug them with his fingers, and wept with gratitude. Some nights, fever took him. He dreamed of the bear again, its breath against his face. He dreamed of Fitzgerald's hand stealing his rifle. And always, somewhere beyond that dream, The Pawnee elder's voice. Learn death. He learned it well. When the rain came, he used a hide scrap as a catch basin and drank until his belly ached. He let the cold water wash his wounds clean. It was the first mercy he'd felt in weeks. Near the confluence of the Cheyenne River, Glass met salvation in flesh and blood. A band of Lakota hunters found him half dead among the reeds. They lifted him onto a travois, carried him back to camp, and treated his wounds with bear grease and sage smoke. They fed him broth, tended his sores, and gave him a name, Wichhapisha, Red Star, for the scars that marked his chest. He stayed among them until the fever broke, listening to their songs at night and watching the smoke climb through the moonlight. When he could stand again, they gave him a skin boat and a small pouch of dried meat. He thanked them the only way he knew, with silence and a steady nod. He drifted down the Missouri, steering with one arm, sleeping by day and moving by night. The current carried him through the wide, cold arteries of the frontier, past trees stripped bare and sandbars gleaming in moonlight. Every mile between him and Fort Kiowa was proof of his defiance. When he finally saw the Palisades rising above the river, smoke curling from chimneys, the faint clang of a blacksmith, he wept. He had crawled, floated, and bled his way across 200 miles of hostile wilderness. And somehow, the earth had not taken him. The bear had tested his body. The betrayal had tested his faith. But this slow, tested his soul. He had survived the impossible, and now he had to decide what to do with survival. The wind was his only teacher now, and class was about to begin. When Hugh Glass rose from fever, the world around him seemed smaller, tighter, more defined by the edges of what he'd lost. The walls of Fort Kiowa were rough logs, blackened by years of smoke. Inside, trappers and traders stared at him, as if they'd seen something return that wasn't supposed to. And in truth, they had. He was a skeleton in furs, leg bound in leather, ribs still splinted. His hair hung in clumps, his skin gray as driftwood. But his eyes, pale, relentless, and calm, burned with purpose. He asked for food, then for a map, then for two names, Fitzgerald and Bridger. The men in the fort traded glances. No one wanted to answer. Finally, an old trader spat tobacco and said quietly, "They went west, up the Missouri, toward Henry's post." Glass nodded once. No curses, no speech. He gathered what he could: a borrowed rifle, a knife, a powder horn, a little jerky, and stepped back into the wilderness that had nearly devoured him. It was late autumn now, the kind that turns the earth hard and the rivers to smoke. Each step was a small negotiation between will and pain. His leg ached, his ribs ground with every breath, but he walked. He followed the bends of the Cheyenne River, moving east by the sun, sleeping light, eating less. At times, he cursed his own heartbeat for not stopping. But something inside him, something older than revenge, kept him upright. It wasn't hate that drove him now. It was unfinished business. Days passed. The land rolled out endless, miles of wind and memory. He saw buffalo in herds that darkened the hills, heard wolves calling to each other across the flats. He felt alive again. Not because he wanted to live, but because death had already failed to claim him. He found Bridger first, near a mule train bound north. The boy saw him from across the campfire, froze, mouth open. The man walking toward him was half a ghost, half a storm. "Mr. Glass!" Bridger's voice trembled, breaking the air like glass under strain. Glass said nothing for a long moment. The fire popped between them. When he finally spoke, his voice was sandpaper and smoke. "You left me with the worms, boy." He paused. "But I ain't one of them yet." Bridger fell to his knees. Words came in bursts. Fear, guilt, pleading. "Fitzgerald made me. I thought you were gone. I swear it." Tears ran down his face. He was barely more than a child, shaking under the weight of a man's sin. Glass stood over him, rifle in hand. He could see the fear, the same look the bear had worn before the final shot. He raised the barrel. The boy closed his eyes, and then nothing. Mercy is the hardest thing a man can aim. Glass let the rifle drop. Bridger opened his eyes, tears cutting clean lines down the dirt on his cheek. Go, Glass said. You'll carry it longer than I ever could. He turned and left the boy sobbing in the dark. But there was still one name left on the map: John Fitzgerald. Word came through trappers. He had joined the U.S. Army, stationed now at Fort Atkinson under the protection of rank and law. A man in uniform was beyond the frontier's judgment. Still, Glass went. He walked through snow and silence, each mile grinding down his anger until it became something colder: resolve. He reached the fort at dusk. The flag snapped in the wind. Men drilled in rows, muskets shining in the dying light. Discipline, order. A world Glass no longer belonged to. He entered the gate, limping, rifle across his back. A sentry stepped forward. State your name and business, Hugh Glass, he said, voice rough but steady. I'm here for a man named Fitzgerald. The guard's eyes widened, but he said nothing, only turned and disappeared into the barracks. Fitzgerald appeared a few minutes later, uniform crisp, face clean, fear barely hidden behind formality. For a moment, the two men just stared. One carried law on his sleeve. The other carried the wilderness in his eyes. Fitzgerald's hand twitched near his belt. Didn't think you'd make it, old man, he said. Glass stepped closer. Neither did I. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to balance between two breaths, one life waiting to take the other. In that moment, everything that had driven him, the pain, the hunger, the crawl, gathered behind his finger on the trigger. He could end it here. No law could stop him. The land would understand. But he didn't. He let the rifle fall. It hit the frozen ground with a thud that echoed louder than any gunshot. Keep it, Glass said. You'll need it more than me. Then he turned and walked into the wind. He left behind no sermon, no threat, only the silence of a man who had walked through death and found something beyond it. A mercy forged in suffering. He rose because the world had forgotten how to believe in men like him. By the spring thaw of 1833, Hugh Glass had become more legend than man, a living ghost drifting along the edge of maps. He trapped along the Yellowstone and Bighorn, traded hides at lonely posts, and slept where the land offered no mercy but never took him twice. He spoke little, drank less. Most who met him later said his eyes seemed to look past the present, as though part of him was still crawling through the mud, somewhere between the Grand River and Fort Kiowa. Civilization was rising now. The wild places that had tested men like Glass were shrinking. Forts replacing forests, boats replacing canoes. The frontier had begun its slow surrender. But Glass remained what the world around him was losing: patient, relentless, untamed. He hunted alone, mended his traps in silence, and watched the new world spread like frost across an old wound. Some said he never stopped searching for Fitzgerald. Others claimed he forgave him completely. The truth, as with all great stories, lives somewhere in the quiet between. In the end, it wasn't revenge that defined Hugh Glass. It was endurance, the crawl, the will of one man against the infinite. The last account of Hugh Glass came, fittingly, by the river. In the early spring of that year, while scouting for beaver with two trappers, he rode into an Arikara ambush, the same tribe whose arrows had nearly ended him a decade before. They found his body days later on the riverbank, rifle across his chest, face calm, eyes half open toward the sky. No sermon, no headstone, just wind and water, and the story that refused to die. For some men, the frontier was a place to conquer. For Hugh Glass, it was a mirror, one that showed what a human being could become when stripped of everything but the will to rise. In the end, the frontier didn't make heroes. It revealed them. If stories of grit, mercy, and endurance stir something in you, subscribe to Frontier Tales of America, because these fires still burn, as long as we keep them told.